Sergeant Daniel Hayes had always believed that silence said more than words ever could. Years of guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier had taught him that. Every step he took at Arlington National Cemetery had to be perfect, measured to the inch, timed to the second, and executed with unwavering respect. It was a sacred duty, one that allowed no room for mistakes or pride. The weight of that service never left him. Even after he moved on from the honor guard, that same discipline stayed in his bones like muscle memory. Now, years later, he found himself stationed at a small army base far from Washington, D.C. The noise of daily military life filled the air, boots thudding on the training field, laughter in the barracks, and the metallic sound of rifles being cleaned. Most soldiers spoke loudly and often, joking about everything from mess hall food to marksmanship scores. But Daniel stayed quiet. He wasn't unfriendly, just reserved. He preferred to listen instead of talk, and that alone made him stand out. When new soldiers met him for the first time, they often couldn't figure him out. He wasn't the kind of man to brag about his experience. In fact, he never mentioned that he had once marched in front of millions of visitors, protecting one of the most honored symbols in the country. He didn't tell them how many hours he had practiced each tiny movement of his step, how he had stood motionless through rain, heat, and snow, or how he had trained himself to block out everything except duty. To his platoon, Daniel was just the quiet guy. He was calm, serious, and didn't laugh much during jokes in the mess hall. Some thought he was too stiff. Others thought he was trying to act better than them. But none of that was true. Daniel just believed that action spoke louder than any story he could tell. At the range or during drills, he did what was expected. No more, no less. He always arrived early, his uniform neat, his rifle spotless. He handled every piece of equipment as if it were something sacred. When other soldiers cleaned their weapons quickly, Daniel took his time, checking every part with careful attention. It wasn't just habit, it was respect. To him, a rifle was more than a tool, it was a responsibility. But not everyone saw it that way. There were a few younger soldiers in the unit who liked to tease him. They didn't mean real harm, but they often laughed behind his back. They were used to a louder kind of confidence, men who boasted about how far they could shoot, how fast they could run, how many targets they could hit. Daniel didn't fit that picture. He didn't talk about his skills or share old stories. He never joined their loud competitions or talked about shooting at long distances. One afternoon, while the squad was preparing for the weekend's shooting exercise, Daniel sat quietly at a bench cleaning his rifle. He used the same old M16 he'd trained with for years. Unlike the others, he hadn't added fancy attachments or scopes. He preferred the iron sights, simple, precise, and honest. A couple of the younger men noticed and grinned. "Hey, Sarge," one of them said with a laugh. "You planning to fight in the old days?" "Where's your scope?" Daniel looked up for a moment, his face calm. "I don't need one," he said simply. The others laughed louder. "No scope? You're not going to hit anything past 100 yards with that old setup." Daniel didn't respond. He only nodded once and continued cleaning the rifle. The teasing rolled off him like water off a stone. He'd learned long ago that quiet confidence often made people uncomfortable, especially those who thought respect had to be loud. But inside, he wasn't angry. He actually felt a small trace of sadness. These young men were good soldiers. They just didn't understand what true precision and patience meant. They measured skill by noise, not by discipline. Later that day, when the squad gathered for briefing, the range instructor, Staff Sergeant Miller, announced that everyone would get a chance to test their accuracy. They'd start with standard drills and later move to long-distance targets. Miller was a good leader and tough but fair. He noticed things others missed. Over the weeks, he'd watched how Daniel handled his weapon, how he never rushed or made excuses. He could tell there was more to the quiet sergeant than he showed. After the briefing, Miller approached Daniel privately. "You've got good control," he said. "Ever done long-range shooting before?" Daniel hesitated, then gave a small smile. "A bit," Miller nodded. He didn't press for details, but something in Daniel's tone told him there was a story behind that modest answer. That evening, Daniel sat outside the barracks, watching the sunset over the training field. The soft orange light reflected on the line of rifles stacked neatly by the wall. For a moment, his mind drifted back to Arlington, to the echo of his own footsteps on the marble, to the sound of tourists holding their breath as the guard passed. Every movement there had meaning. Every second demanded perfection. He missed that stillness sometimes, that sense of sacred duty. Out here things were louder, rougher, more casual, but he reminded himself that discipline wasn't something you left behind. It was something you carried wherever you went. Whether he was standing before the tomb or lying in the dust at a range, his standard had to stay the same. The next morning, during physical training, Daniel worked quietly but efficiently. When others joked or complained, he focused on breathing and rhythm. It wasn't pride that pushed him. It was habit. After years of guarding a symbol of eternal respect, he couldn't bear to do anything halfway. Some soldiers began to notice. They stopped teasing as much. They saw that even without talking, Daniel seemed to command a quiet kind of authority. When he corrected someone's shooting stance or showed how to adjust their breathing, they listened. His advice was always gentle, never proud. Still, a few men continued to mock behind his back, whispering that he was too serious, too slow, or too old school. But Daniel didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that real skill didn't need an audience. On the Friday before the range day, the squad spent the afternoon preparing their rifles. Daniel checked his iron sights again, adjusting them carefully, feeling the weight of the metal in his hands. To him, it wasn't just a weapon. It was a piece of history, something that deserved respect. The others laughed when they saw he still had no scope attached. "You sure you don't want some glass, Sarge?" one asked, holding up his shiny new optic. "Makes life easier." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm fine." They shook their heads and went back to their work, still whispering jokes. As the sun dipped below the horizon that night, Daniel sat on his bunk, cleaning his weapon one last time. He moved slowly, methodically, every motion deliberate. In his mind, he replayed the drills he'd practiced for years: the breathing control, the trigger squeeze, the awareness of wind and distance. It was second nature now, as natural as walking. He thought of the tomb again, the marble, the silence, the precision. People thought that guarding the unknown soldier was about ceremony, but it was really about discipline. It was about understanding that perfection wasn't for glory. It was for respect. Respect for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the barracks. Tomorrow the range would be full of noise, gunfire, laughter, shouting. But for him, every shot would be like a step at Arlington, measured, calm, exact. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But part of him knew that soon his actions might speak for him in a way words never could. When lights went out, the room filled with soft snoring and shifting beds. Daniel lay awake a little longer, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't thinking about competition or pride. He was thinking about balance, patience, and the steady rhythm that had guided him for so long. Outside, the night wind blew across the training field. Somewhere in the darkness, the targets waited, silent and distant, like a test of quiet honor. Tomorrow, he would meet them with the same calm respect he had shown every duty he'd ever held. He didn't know it yet, but that day on the range would remind everyone, and including himself, that true skill doesn't need applause. It only needs focus, humility, and one steady heartbeat behind the trigger. The morning of the range exercise began before sunrise. The air was cool and the sky carried a soft gray light that slowly turned gold as the sun began to rise. Sergeant Daniel Hayes woke up early just as he always did. He folded his blanket neatly, polished his boots until they caught the first light, and double-checked his rifle. Every motion was calm and practiced, like part of a quiet ritual. When he stepped outside the barracks, he could already hear laughter and talking near the trucks. The younger soldiers were in high spirits, joking and teasing one another. It was a normal start to a training day. Some carried rifles fitted with shiny scopes and attachments, while others had brand new gloves or tactical glasses. Everyone was eager to show off. Daniel moved among them without saying much. He helped load the equipment, checked the ammunition boxes, and climbed into the truck. During the ride to the range, the soldiers around him talked nonstop. They compared shooting scores, argued about brands of optics, and bragged about who could hit the farthest target. One young private named Mason leaned over to the others and said with a grin, "Bet the old sergeant here still aims like it's the 80s. No scope, no tech, just vibes." The group burst out laughing. Daniel didn't look up. He just adjusted the strap on his rifle and stared out the window. He wasn't angry. He'd heard that kind of talk before. He understood that young soldiers often joked to hide their nerves or to feel confident. He let it go. The trucks rolled into the training range, a wide stretch of open land dotted with bunkers and steel targets that shimmered in the morning sun. The smell of dust and gun oil filled the air. Flags marked distances, 100 yards, 300, 500, and the farthest one, 800 yards, barely visible at the far end of the field. Staff Sergeant Miller stood in front of them, clipboard in hand. "Listen up, everyone," he called out. "Today we're running a full qualification and distance challenge. We'll start with short range, then move up. And yes, there's an 800-yard plate out there, so I hope you brought your patience." The soldiers laughed and cheered. Daniel remained silent, but his eyes studied the targets. The 800-yard mark looked small, but he noticed the wind flags along the field, the slight leftward movement of the tall grass, and the shifting brightness of the sun. His mind automatically calculated adjustments, habits built from years of perfect precision. They began with warm-up shots. One by one, soldiers took turns firing at 100 and 300 yards. The air soon filled with the sound of gunfire, sharp cracks echoing across the range. The smell of burnt powder mixed with the dry air. Most of the young soldiers performed well enough. They hit the closer targets easily, laughing and cheering after each good shot. When Daniel's turn came, he stepped up quietly. His rifle looked plain beside the others. No scope, no attachments, just a simple set of iron sights. "Still rocking the old setup, huh?" Mason said from behind him. "This should be fun." Daniel didn't reply. He loaded his magazine, lay down in the prone position, and steadied his breathing. He didn't rush. He aimed at the 300-yard plate, adjusted slightly for wind, and fired once. Clang. The sound of a perfect hit. He fired again. Clang. Another hit. He emptied the rest of the magazine. All clean shots. Then he stood, cleared his weapon, and stepped back in line without saying a word. The others grew quiet for a moment, but the laughter returned quickly. "Beginner's luck," someone joked. "Let's see him try that at 800. As the morning went on, the group moved to longer distances. At 500 yards, even with scopes, some soldiers began to miss. The wind had picked up slightly, making it harder to keep aim steady. Voices grew louder as frustration replaced confidence. When Daniel took his turn, he adjusted calmly, breathing slow and even. Every squeeze of the trigger was followed by the soft, clear sound of steel ringing in the distance. His movements were steady and sure. There was no showmanship, no excitement, just quiet focus. Miller, the range instructor, watched closely. He could tell Daniel wasn't showing off. He was simply doing what he knew. Miller smiled slightly. He'd seen soldiers like that before, the ones who didn't need to talk because their discipline spoke for them. By noon, the squad took a break under a shade tent. The air shimmered with heat, and canteens passed from hand to hand. Jokes continued to fly, though the laughter was quieter now. Some soldiers were tired from the morning's drills. Mason, still full of energy, said loudly, "All right, when we hit 800 yards, I want to see if our quiet sergeant still thinks he can hang with us. You in, Hayes?" Daniel looked up from cleaning his rifle. "If there's a target, I'll shoot," he said simply. A few laughed, but Miller caught the tone, calm, confident, without challenge. It wasn't pride. It was just fact. The afternoon sun burned hot as they prepared for the final test. The 800-yard plate stood like a silver coin in the far distance. Even with scopes, most soldiers found it difficult to see clearly. The heat waves rising from the ground made the target shimmer and blur. Miller gathered everyone near the firing line. "All right," he said. "This one's for pride only. Scoped rifles allowed. Anyone who hits that target gets bragging rights till next week." The line filled quickly. One after another, soldiers took turns firing at the far plate. The air cracked with rifle shots, each one followed by a long pause as everyone waited to hear the sound of steel. Most shots missed. Some came close and the dust around the plate kicked up, but few could land a hit. Mason tried next. He took his time, peering through his high-end scope. He fired, adjusted, and fired again. Dust flew near the edge of the plate, but not a single clang came. He lowered his rifle with a frustrated sigh. "That wind's tricky," he muttered. Then Miller turned to Daniel. "You're up, Sergeant," he said, a slight grin on his face. "Still sticking with those irons?" Daniel nodded once. "Always," the group murmured. Some smirked. Others whispered that he was about to embarrass himself. An 800-yard shot with iron sights wasn't just hard, and it was nearly impossible. Daniel lay down on the mat, the same calm expression on his face. He rested his cheek against the stock, adjusted the rear sight, and watched the distant shimmer of the target. He felt the wind on his face, the pull of the trigger under his finger. He slowed his breathing, in, out, just like during the silent nights in Arlington when he had timed every motion with his heartbeat. The field fell quiet around him. He exhaled and fired. The shot cracked across the range. For a long second, nothing happened. Then, from the far distance came a clear, bright clang, a sound so distinct that even the wind seemed to pause. The silence that followed was louder than any noise before it. Every head turned toward the target, and every soldier stared at Daniel in disbelief. Without looking up, he chambered another round, adjusted slightly, and fired again. Clang, another perfect hit. He fired a third time. Clang. 3 hits. 3 perfect shots, no one spoke. Even Miller just stood there, a faint smile growing under his hat. Daniel slowly stood, cleared his rifle, and said quietly, "Range cold." Then he walked back toward the benches, calm and unbothered, as if nothing special had happened. Behind him, the other soldiers remained silent, the weight of that moment sinking in. The same man they had laughed at all morning had just done what few could ever manage. Not through luck. Not through noise, but through pure focus and skill. And though no one said it out loud yet, everyone there knew one thing for certain. From that moment on, no one would ever mock the tomb guard again. The moment after Daniel Hayes hit the target for the 3rd time, the range fell completely silent. The sound of that last clang still echoed faintly across the open field. For several long seconds, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to stop. The men who had laughed before now stood still, their faces showing surprise and quiet awe. Daniel didn't look around for praise. He simply cleared his weapon with steady hands, just as he always did, and placed it safely on the bench. Then he walked calmly toward the back of the group. There was no smile on his face, no prideful look in his eyes. It was just another completed task to him, one more act of precision and focus. Staff Sergeant Miller finally broke the silence with a low whistle. "Well," he said slowly, "I think that settles it." A few of the soldiers laughed nervously. The sound wasn't mocking anymore. It was filled with disbelief and respect. Mason, who had been the loudest earlier, still had his mouth slightly open. He blinked a few times before saying, "He actually hit it. 3 times. Another soldier nodded quietly. "With iron sights," he added. "No scope, nothing." The group started to talk again, but the tone had changed completely. Where there had been jokes, there was now curiosity. The same men who once saw Daniel as the quiet, old-fashioned soldier were now looking at him differently, like someone they wanted to understand. Miller looked over at Daniel, who was now sitting under the shade tent, refilling his canteen. "Hayes," he called, "what kind of training did you have before this unit?" Daniel looked up, thoughtful for a moment. "Honor Guard," he said simply. That one phrase made several heads turn. Everyone had heard of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, but few truly understood what it meant to serve there. A hush spread again, softer this time. Miller nodded slowly, now understanding much more. "That explains it," he said under his breath. The rest of the afternoon passed differently. When the soldiers went up to shoot again, they glanced at Daniel, hoping to pick up something from the way he held his rifle or how he adjusted for wind. Even Mason, who had been teasing before, began to watch carefully, noticing how Daniel breathed before each shot and how his movements never wasted energy. For Daniel, though, nothing had changed inside. He didn't care for attention or glory. In his mind, what mattered was doing the task correctly, not being seen doing it. The respect that began to grow around him didn't inflate his pride. Instead, it reminded him of something he had learned long ago while guarding the tomb, that quiet mastery often speaks loudest when others least expect it. When the range exercise ended, Miller gathered the group around for closing remarks. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky orange and gold. "Good work today, everyone," he said. "You all learned something about distance and patience. But I hope you also learned something else. Skill doesn't always make noise." A few of the soldiers nodded slowly. Everyone knew who Miller was talking about, but Daniel just kept his head down, quietly packing away his rifle. On the drive back to base, the mood was much different from the morning. The loud laughter was gone, replaced by quiet conversation. Some soldiers still glanced at Daniel from time to time, as if trying to find the secret behind his calmness. Mason finally turned around in his seat and asked, "Hey, Sarge, that 800-yard shot, how did you do it? Like, what were you thinking?" Daniel looked out the window, watching the road pass by. "I wasn't thinking about distance," he said softly. "I was thinking about consistency. One breath, one focus, same as always." Mason frowned slightly, trying to understand. "But you weren't nervous?" Daniel gave a small shake of his head. "Nervousness comes from trying to prove something. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just did my job." The truck went quiet again. Mason sat back, nodding slowly. For the first time, he began to understand that true confidence didn't come from talking big. It came from being steady no matter who was watching. When they reached the base, evening had already fallen. The men unloaded their rifles, checked equipment back in, and walked toward the mess hall for dinner. Inside, the usual laughter returned, but now there was a different energy, a quiet respect that surrounded Daniel even when he wasn't speaking. Miller walked over to where Daniel sat alone at a corner table. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked. Daniel nodded politely. The sergeant smiled, placing his tray down. "I've been in the Army for 20 years, he said. "I've seen all kinds of shooters, the loud ones, the fast ones, and the ones who think they know everything. But you, Hayes, you reminded me of something important today." Daniel looked up.
"What's that, sir?"
"That discipline doesn't fade," Miller said. "It stays with the right man wherever he goes." Daniel gave a faint smile. "Discipline is all I have, sir. It's the only thing that doesn't change." Miller nodded thoughtfully. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You've earned every bit of respect you got today, and maybe even taught some of these boys a lesson about humility." After Miller left, a few younger soldiers came over, their earlier teasing replaced by genuine curiosity. Mason was the first to speak. "Sarge, can you maybe show us how you read the wind like that? I couldn't even tell which way it was blowing." Daniel looked at him, then nodded. "Tomorrow morning. Bring your rifle. We'll start early." The next day, Mason and two others showed up at the range before sunrise. Daniel was already there, setting up quietly. The air was still cool, and a thin layer of fog hung over the field. "First thing," Daniel said softly, "you don't fight the wind. You work with it. Watch the grass, the flags, even the shimmer in the air. They all talk. You just have to listen." He showed them how to line up their sights, how to control their breathing, and how to let the rifle become an extension of their body rather than just a tool. His voice was calm, patient, never rushed. He didn't act like a teacher. He acted like a guide. The soldiers listened carefully, realizing that shooting wasn't about strength or fancy gear. It was about focus and respect. By mid-morning, Mason managed to hit the 500-yard plate for the first time. His eyes lit up and he looked at Daniel in surprise. "I did it." Daniel smiled faintly. "You did. Now do it again." They laughed together, not as superior and subordinate, but as soldiers sharing knowledge. From that day on, the teasing stopped completely. The others began calling him Sir Silent, not out of mockery, but as a sign of quiet admiration. Over the next few weeks, more soldiers started showing up early at the range to learn from him. Daniel never turned anyone away. He shared what he knew freely, but never bragged. He only asked one thing from them: respect for their weapon, for their discipline, and for the men who came before them. Every time Daniel picked up his rifle, he thought about the tomb, the unknown soldiers who had no names, no fame, and no voice. In their silence, he found his purpose. In his discipline, he honored them. Even though that 800-yard shot became a story that spread across the base, Daniel never talked about it again. For him, it wasn't about the distance or the applause. It was simply about doing what he had always done, serving with quiet excellence. And whether his audience was a crowd of tourists at Arlington or a handful of curious soldiers at a dusty range, his message remained the same: true strength never shouts. It stands firm, steady, and silent. The following week, the platoon returned to the range. The sun had barely risen when Daniel Hayes stepped onto the field, his rifle resting easily in his hands. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of dew and gunpowder. Around him, the younger soldiers were chatting and joking, but their tone had changed. There was curiosity now. a sense of respect that hadn't been there before. Mason, who had been the loudest the week before, approached first. "Sarge, today I want to learn more about those long shots," he said. "I need to know how you see the wind, the distance, everything." Daniel nodded silently, adjusting the iron sights on his rifle. "It's all about patience," he said. "And listening. The wind, the air, even the way your body feels. You don't just aim with your eyes. You aim with your mind and your body together." The others gathered near, eager to see how he worked. Some still had scopes on their rifles, but now they watched Daniel's old-fashioned iron sights with interest. He moved with calm precision, checking each part of his rifle, examining the flags along the range, and observing the slightest shimmer in the heat rising from the targets. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. Daniel sat up at the firing line, laying prone as he always did. He didn't rush. He watched the distant 800-yard target, the small steel plate barely visible against the horizon. The wind flags were flickering lightly, showing a subtle left-to-right movement. Most soldiers would panic at the idea of hitting that target, even with a scope. Daniel simply adjusted for the angle, steadied his breathing, and prepared for the shot. Mason leaned closer. "Are you really going to do it again?" he asked quietly. "With just iron sights?" Daniel glanced at him. "I don't need to prove anything," he said softly. "But if the target's there, I'll take the shot." The group grew silent. Some of the soldiers who had mocked him before now felt a mix of curiosity and awe. Daniel's quiet confidence had replaced his old reputation for seriousness with something far stronger: credibility. He fired the first shot. The rifle cracked sharply across the field. The small plate at 800 yards rang with a clear clang. Mason's eyes widened. "How?" he whispered. Daniel adjusted slightly and fired again. Another clang. The sound carried far and echoed against the hills. He fired a third time. Clang, every shot landed perfectly. Everyone, the young soldiers, were stunned. Even Miller, standing at the side, couldn't hide his smile. He had seen Daniel do this before, but watching it again, seeing the discipline in action, was almost mesmerizing. Finally, Daniel sat back on his heels and set the rifle down. "Range cold," he said simply. No one moved for a few moments. Then slowly the younger soldiers began to gather around him. Mason, still staring at the distant target, asked, "Sarge, how do you stay so calm? Most of us would have been shaking just thinking about it." Daniel took a deep breath and smiled faintly. "You don't think about the distance. You think about each step leading to the shot. One breath, one squeeze, one focus at a time. If you worry about the whole thing at once, it will fail." The other soldiers listened closely. They realized that hitting an 800-yard target wasn't just about skill. It was about patience, preparation, and control. Daniel's calmness wasn't luck. It was learned over years of careful training and dedication. Over the next hour, Daniel taught them how to read the range. He showed them how to observe the flags, how to feel the wind against their faces, and how to adjust for small shifts in temperature or light. He demonstrated the iron sights again and explained why he preferred them to scopes. The simplicity demanded complete focus and exact attention to every detail. Mason tried to follow along, and Daniel guided him with quiet patience. "Don't rush," he said. "If you hurry, your hands will shake. If your hands shake, your shot will fail. Feel the rifle, not fight it." After several tries, Mason managed to land a solid hit at 500 yards. He jumped up and laughed in surprise, looking at Daniel. I actually did it." Daniel nodded calmly. "Now do it again. Consistency matters more than one perfect shot." Mason grinned and nodded, understanding the lesson. It wasn't enough to hit once. Real skill was in repetition, in doing it correctly every time. The other soldiers also began attempting longer shots, following Daniel's instructions. Slowly, the energy at the range shifted. Where there had been teasing and mockery, there was now focus and learning. The men who had once doubted him now tried to emulate his calm, measured approach. Even Staff Sergeant Miller was impressed. He watched as Daniel moved among the younger soldiers, showing subtle adjustments, giving small tips, and quietly encouraging them. No one had ever seen him teach like this, and without pride. Without seeking attention, only sharing knowledge. By late afternoon, several soldiers had successfully hit the 500 and 600-yard targets. The 800-yard plate remained a challenge for most, but Daniel's example had given them confidence they hadn't had before. They now understood that skill came from discipline, focus, and patience, not just fancy equipment or loud talk. When the range session ended, the platoon gathered for debriefing. Miller addressed the group, smiling. "Today wasn't just about hitting targets," he said. "It was about learning. You saw how discipline and patience can make the impossible possible. And Sergeant Hayes, you reminded all of us what it means to be truly skilled." Daniel stayed quiet as usual. He packed his rifle slowly, checking every part and making sure it was clean. He didn't respond to the praise. It wasn't for him. For him, the lesson had already been clear. The real reward was seeing the soldiers learn and improve. As the group walked back to the barracks, Mason and a few others followed Daniel closely. "Sarge," Mason said quietly, "do you think any of us will ever get close to that 800-yard shot?" Daniel looked at him calmly. "If you practice with focus, patience, and respect for what you're doing, you'll get there. It won't be easy. Nothing worth achieving ever is, but it's possible." That evening, the men ate together in the mess hall, talking quietly. The teasing from before had vanished completely. They shared their struggles, their mistakes, and their small successes. Daniel listened, offering small tips and guidance, never bragging, never demanding attention. Mason kept glancing at him, a mixture of admiration and curiosity on his face. "Sarge," he said finally, "I don't think I'll ever forget today. Not just the shots, but how you stayed so calm. It's different, inspiring." Daniel gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Calmness is not talent," he said. "It's practice and patience. You can have both if you want them." Later that night, as Daniel lay on his bunk, he reflected on the day. The range had become more than a place to shoot. It had become a classroom, a stage for quiet lessons about discipline and respect. He thought about the soldiers who had once mocked him and how they were now learning, growing and understanding. Even though he had been laughed at, doubted, and overlooked, he realized that action always speaks louder than words. The respect he had earned was not from bragging or showing off. It came from remaining steady, patient, and focused, the same lessons he had learned at the tomb of the unknown soldier. He closed his eyes, thinking of the distant steel plate, the soft echoes of the clang, and the way the young soldiers had looked at him with surprise and respect. A small smile crossed his face. That quiet moment of accomplishment, shared silently with others, was worth more than any applause he could have received. Because in the end, it wasn't about the shot itself. It was about the example, the lesson, and the quiet strength that comes from years of discipline, patience, and unwavering focus. The next morning, the base felt different. The soldiers who had once laughed at Daniel Hayes now approached him with quiet respect. Even the ones who had been skeptical before now sought guidance. The word about his 800-yard iron sight shots had spread throughout the platoon, and everyone wanted to learn from the man who had shown them what discipline and focus could achieve. Daniel arrived at the range early, as he always did. The air was cool, filled with the soft sounds of birds and the distant hum of the barracks waking up. He set up his rifle carefully, checking the iron sights and cleaning the barrel one last time. There was no rush in his movements, every action measured, precise, and calm. Mason and a few others were already there, rifles ready, eyes full of curiosity. "Sarge," Mason said quietly, "can we go over the wind adjustments again? I don't think I fully understood yesterday." Daniel nodded. "It's about observation," he said. "Don't fight what the wind does. Work with it. Watch the flags, the grass, the heat waves. Let them guide you. Listen to them." The soldiers leaned in, trying to understand. Daniel's teaching style was quiet, patient, and calm. He didn't yell or demand attention. He demonstrated with small, deliberate movements, showing how even subtle changes in posture or breathing could affect a shot. By mid-morning, the group began attempting longer shots again. Some tried the 500-yard plates, while others attempted 600. Each time, Daniel offered gentle guidance, showing them how to focus, adjust, and remain patient. Mistakes were met with instruction, not criticism. Slowly, the soldiers began to improve, hitting targets that had seemed impossible the day before. Mason finally got a solid hit at 600 yards. He jumped up laughing and turned to Daniel. "I did it. I actually hit it." Daniel simply nodded. "Good. Now do it again." Consistency is more important than one perfect shot. The lesson wasn't lost on the others. One by one, they followed Daniel's guidance, learning to read the range, adjust their breathing, and handle their rifles with care. They began to understand that skill wasn't just about speed or strength, it was about patience, focus, and respect for the rifle and the target. After several hours, Miller called everyone together for a break. He glanced at Daniel with admiration. "You've taught them a lot in a short time," he said quietly. "They've never learned like this before." Daniel shrugged lightly. "They just needed to listen. Discipline is the same everywhere. Once you learn it, it carries you through anything." As the sun climbed higher, the 800-yard plate remained at the far end of the range. Most soldiers didn't even attempt it. They had learned to respect the distance and the difficulty. Daniel, however, felt calm. He walked to the firing line, laid down in the prone position, and focused. His breathing was steady, his mind clear, his movements deliberate. He fired the first shot. Clang. The target rang with a clear, precise note. The soldiers watched in silence. Mason whispered to another, "I don't think I'll ever forget that sound." Daniel adjusted slightly and fired again. Clang, the third shot followed just as perfectly. Clang. No one clapped, no one shouted. But the silence was heavier than any applause could have been. The respect in that quiet moment spoke louder than words. Daniel stood and cleared his rifle. "Range cold," he said, his voice calm and steady. Mason walked over, eyes wide. "Sarge, how do you do it? How do you stay so steady under pressure?" Daniel looked at him for a moment. "You don't think about pressure," he said. "You think about the task. One step at a time. One shot at a time. Let the work you've done carry you. Don't fight it, don't rush it." The lesson sank in for everyone. They realized that the real skill wasn't in hitting the target. Anyone could eventually do that with enough practice. But in the calm, quiet preparation and focus that made such a shot possible in the first place. That evening, back at the barracks, the atmosphere had changed completely. The soldiers talked quietly, sharing tips, practice techniques, and insights. Mason approached Daniel again, this time with genuine curiosity and respect. "Sarge," he said, "I think I understand now. It's not just shooting. It's everything. Discipline, focus, patience." Daniel smiled faintly. "Exactly. That's the lesson. It applies to everything and not just shooting." Over the next few weeks, Daniel became a mentor to the younger soldiers. They would gather early at the range, eager to learn the calm, patient approach he demonstrated. He never boasted, never demanded attention. He simply guided them, showing them that quiet consistency and respect for their craft mattered more than noise or pride. Mason eventually managed to hit the 800-yard plate himself. When he did, he looked at Daniel almost in disbelief. "I did it," he said softly. Daniel simply nodded. "Good. Now do it again." The lesson was clear. Skill wasn't about luck, equipment, or even natural talent. It was about practice, focus, and patience. It was about listening, observing, and respecting both your tools and your surroundings. In the evenings, Daniel would often sit quietly, reflecting on his own journey. He thought about the tomb of the unknown soldier, the countless hours spent practicing perfect steps, the discipline that had shaped him. That discipline hadn't left him. It had followed him to every new challenge, from guarding the tomb to teaching young soldiers at a dusty range. And now he realized the same lessons were spreading quietly among the men who had once mocked him. They had learned more than marksmanship. They had learned respect, patience, and the power of quiet confidence. One afternoon, Mason approached him again. "Sarge, I think I finally get it," he said. "It's not just about hitting the target. It's about how you carry yourself, how you think, how you focus. You don't need to shout or brag. Your actions do it for you." Daniel smiled. "Exactly. That's what discipline really is. It shows in what you do, not what you say." By the end of that month, the range had changed. The teasing was gone. The soldiers moved with more focus, watched each other's technique, and learned to be patient with themselves. The story of the 800-yard iron sight shots became a quiet legend on the base. Not because Daniel wanted it, but because his actions spoke louder than words ever could. Daniel himself didn't seek attention or praise. For him, the true reward was seeing the men improve, gaining confidence and understanding the lessons he had learned over years of service. The tomb of the unknown soldier had taught him that perfection was a duty, not a choice. And now, he was passing that same lesson on to the next generation. In quiet moments, Daniel thought about the soldiers who had mocked him at first. He felt no anger, only understanding. They had been learning in their own way what he had known all along, that true skill, discipline, and respect could not be rushed, could not be faked, and could not be learned from words alone. It had to be shown through action. By the end of his tour at the base, Daniel had become more than just a sergeant. He had become a mentor, a teacher, and an example of what quiet excellence looked like. The men who had once doubted him now carried his lessons forward, not just in shooting, but in every part of their military life. And whenever a new soldier joined the platoon, someone would quietly tell them, "Ask Sergeant Hayes about the 800-yard shot." Not to brag, but to remind them that true skill and discipline are earned silently, through focus, patience, and respect. The same values that had guided Daniel Hayes from the tomb of the unknown soldier to the open field of the range. In the end, the story wasn't about an iron sight rifle, an impossible distance, or a single perfect shot. It was about a man who embodied discipline, patience, and humility, and who, through quiet action, taught others that greatness doesn't need applause. It only needs focus, dedication, and the courage to remain steady no matter who is watching. And that lesson, Daniel knew, would last far longer than any single day at the range, or even a single achievement. It would stay with the soldiers he had taught, shaping how they approached every challenge, every duty, and every moment of their lives.